There is something peculiar about the human spirit that I have observed through decades of sitting with souls in the deepest throes of their becoming. We have this strange belief, this comfortable delusion, really, that we can hold on to things forever, that we can grasp people, situations, identities, and somehow make them permanent fixtures in the architecture of our lives. But I want to tell you something that may disturb your sleep tonight, something that the unconscious has whispered to me through countless dreams and slips of the tongue and moments of profound recognition. The moment you truly walk away from what no longer serves your becoming, from what has become a prison disguised as security, everything in the invisible world begins to rearrange itself around your courage. Now, I do not speak of walking away lightly, as if it were some fashionable notion or temporary rebellion against difficulty. No, I speak of that profound moment when the soul finally says, enough. When something deep within you, older and wiser than your conscious mind, recognizes that staying would mean a kind of death. Not the death of the body, but something far more tragic. The death of who you were meant to become. You see, most people live their entire lives in what I call the provisional life. They tell themselves that their real existence will begin tomorrow, next year, when the circumstances are right, when they have gathered enough courage, when the path becomes clearer. But the provisional life is a kind of sleepwalking. It is the ego's way of avoiding the terrible responsibility of actually living. I remember sitting with a patient once, a man in his middle years who had spent decades in a marriage that had long since ceased to nourish either partner. He would come to me week after week, describing his misery with the precision of a botanist cataloging dying plants. Yet when I would gently inquire about what prevented him from making a change, he would retreat into a litany of practical concerns. The house, the children, what others would think, financial security. But beneath all these reasonable concerns, I could sense something else. Terror. Not the fear of practical consequences, but the primal terror of stepping into the unknown, of becoming responsible for his own existence. It is far easier to remain trapped in familiar misery than to risk the uncertainty of authentic life. And yet one day he simply did not return for his appointment. Weeks later, I received a letter. He had left his marriage, moved to a small town where he had always dreamed of opening a bookshop. And for the first time in 20 years, he could sleep through the night without waking in a cold sweat. But here is what struck me most profoundly about his letter. He wrote that the moment he made the decision, truly made it in his bones and not just in his mind, doors began opening that he had not even known existed. This is what I mean when I say everything shifts. There are forces at work in the psyche and the world that respond to genuine commitment to one's own becoming. The unconscious, which had been sending him dreams of suffocation and endless corridors for years, suddenly began presenting images of flight, of wide open spaces, of hands reaching toward light. But let me be very clear about something. This shifting, this rearrangement of reality around authentic choice, it is not magic in the way that children understand magic. It is not that the universe suddenly becomes your personal servant, granting wishes and smoothing all paths. No, it is something far more profound and far more demanding. When you truly walk away from what diminishes you, you step into alignment with what I call the self. Not the ego self, that small, frightened creature that clings to the known, but the larger self, the totality of who you are meant to become. And the self has its own intelligence, its own way of moving through the world that the conscious mind cannot foresee or control. I have seen this pattern repeat itself countless times. The woman who finally leaves the career that was slowly crushing her spirit, only to discover talents she never knew she possessed. The man who ends a friendship built on mutual complaint and criticism, only to find himself surrounded by people who share his genuine interests. The person who stops pretending to be someone they are not, only to attract the very experiences they had been seeking while wearing their false mask. But here is where it becomes truly interesting from a psychological perspective. The moment of walking away is never really about the external situation. It is about the internal shift that has been building, often for years, in the depths of the unconscious. The marriage, the job, the friendship, the city, these are merely the outer clothing of an inner transformation that has been demanding recognition. The unconscious mind, you see, is far more intelligent than we give it credit for. It knows when we are living in opposition to our essential nature. It knows when we are betraying our deepest values in the name of security or acceptance. And it will create symptoms, dreams, accidents, slips of the tongue, anything to get our attention, to wake us up from the trance of provisional living. Walking away, then, is not really an action we take. It is the outer manifestation of an inner awakening that has been trying to emerge. And when we finally align our external life with this inner knowing, when we stop resisting the current of our own becoming, the world responds because we are finally moving with the grain of our own nature rather than against it. This is why everything shifts. Not because we have somehow manipulated reality, but because we have stopped fighting the deep intelligence of our own soul. Now, I must tell you something that will perhaps sound strange, even unsettling. The walking away I speak of, this profound shift that rearranges reality around your courage, it is not a single event, but a kind of death and rebirth that happens in stages. Each stage strips away another layer of the false self, another comfortable lie we have told ourselves about who we must be to survive in this world. I think of a woman who came to see me many years ago. She had been raised to believe that her worth lay in her ability to anticipate and meet the needs of others. Her mother, her husband, her children, her neighbors, even strangers on the street could sense this quality in her, and they drew from her like thirsty plants draw water from the soil. She came to me exhausted, depleted, speaking of headaches and sleepless nights, but unable to name what was truly wrong. For months, we sat together in my study as she slowly began to recognize the prison she had built from her own kindness. But recognition, you understand, is only the first death. The ego recognizes the pattern, but still clings desperately to it, because it is all we have known ourselves to be. She would leave our sessions with great insights, only to return the following week, having once again sacrificed her own needs on the altar of others' expectations. Then came the second death, the one that is far more frightening. She began to say no. Small no's at first. She declined to host the family gathering that year. She stopped answering every telephone call immediately. She allowed her neighbor to solve her own domestic crisis without rushing to intervene. And with each no, she felt as though she was betraying something fundamental about herself. This is what most people do not understand about authentic transformation. It feels like betrayal because you are indeed betraying something, but not your true nature. You are betraying the false self, the mask you have worn for so long that you have forgotten there is a face beneath it. And this false self will not go quietly. It will create guilt, anxiety, even physical symptoms to convince you to return to your cage. But if you persist, if you continue to honor what is authentic rather than what is expected, something remarkable begins to happen. The third death occurs, the death of the need for others to understand your choices. This woman discovered that she no longer required her family's approval of her newfound boundaries. She no longer needed her friends to validate her decision to pursue her own interests. She had found something far more valuable than external approval. She had found her own voice. And it was then that everything began to shift around her. Not because she had become selfish or uncaring, but because she was finally operating from a place of genuine choice rather than compulsion. Her relationships changed. Some people, those who had been unconsciously feeding off her endless giving, drifted away. But others, drawn by her newfound authenticity, entered her life. People who could meet her as an equal rather than as a resource to be consumed. You see, when we live from the false self, we attract relationships and circumstances that support that falseness. The universe, if I may speak of it in such terms, responds to what we truly believe about ourselves, not what we pretend to believe. If you believe deep down that your worth depends on your usefulness to others, you will magnetize people who need to use you. If you believe that love must be earned through endless sacrifice, you will find yourself surrounded by those who are willing to take but not to give. But the moment you begin to honor your authentic nature, to speak from your genuine voice, rather than from the script handed to you by family, society, or tradition, the magnetic field around your life shifts. You begin to attract what is aligned with your truth rather than what feeds your wounds. I've observed this phenomenon countless times, and it never ceases to amaze me. The businessman who stops pretending to care about profits above all else suddenly finds himself working with partners who share his deeper values. The artist who stops creating what she thinks the market wants and begins expressing her genuine vision discovers an audience hungry for exactly that authenticity. The man who stops performing the role of the strong, silent provider and allows his vulnerability to show finds himself in relationships of genuine intimacy for the first time in his life. This is not mere coincidence. There are currents in life, patterns of meaning and connection that operate below the level of conscious awareness. When we align ourselves with our deeper truth, we begin to swim with these currents rather than against them. We stop exhausting ourselves trying to force outcomes and instead allow ourselves to be carried by forces far more intelligent than our small planning minds. But let me speak plainly about the cost of this alignment, because there is always a cost, and it is not small. Walking away from the false self means walking away from many of the identities and securities that have defined your life. The people who knew you in your old patterns may not recognize you in your new authenticity. The roles you played, the masks you wore, these must be left behind like outgrown clothing. There's a period, sometimes brief, sometimes extending for months or even years, when you exist in a kind of liminal space. You have left behind who you were, but you have not yet fully become who you are meant to be. This is perhaps the most difficult time because you have no familiar reference points, no well-worn paths to follow. You must learn to trust something deeper than habit, something more reliable than the opinions of others. So I leave you with this general question, one that only you can answer in the quiet of your own heart. What are you clinging to that has already died? What false self still whispers that safety lies in remaining small? The moment you truly walk away from what diminishes your soul, everything shifts. Not because the world changes, but because you finally remember who you have always been.